The chandelier trembled as cruel laughter rolled through the marble halls, echoing like broken glass in the silence of fear. Alexander said, "Look at him, dirt on his shoes in my father's house." Ethan stood frozen, his patched coat damp from the rain, his hands clenched at his sides. Margaret's tired eyes flickered with worry as she stood near the doorway, her silence heavy as stone. Lord Harrington's cane struck the floor sharply, his voice cold as steel when he commanded silence. Clara hid in the corner, her eyes catching every cruel smile and broken word. Ethan swallowed hard, his jaw tight, but no shame touched his gaze. Alexander sneered. "Do you even know where you are, beggar?" Ethan's lips parted, his voice low and steady. "I know exactly where I am." The laughter faltered for a moment, replaced by unease, as if the walls themselves held their breath. The guests whispered as Alexander circled Ethan, his words sharp as blades. Alexander said, "You smell of rain and dirt, and yet you dare walk here?" Ethan stood still, his silence heavier than defiance, his stare fixed and unyielding. Margaret gripped her apron tightly, her breath caught in her chest, wishing to shield him from the shame. Lord Harrington leaned back in his chair, his glare filled with contempt, the weight of his power crushing the room. Clara moved closer to the wall, her ears catching every poisoned word. Ethan finally said, "Gold buys silence, but truth costs nothing." The words landed like stones, and for the first time Alexander's smile faltered. The crowd fell into an uneasy hush, sensing that cruelty alone might not shatter this man. The echo of laughter clung to the walls, but Margaret's silence pressed harder than words. Her eyes moved between Ethan and Alexander, her heart torn by memories of the cruelty she had endured in this house. Alexander said, "He belongs in the gutter, not here." Ethan answered with quiet fire, "A man's worth is not measured in carpets or chandeliers." Lord Harrington's fingers tapped his cane, rhythm like a ticking clock of judgment. Clara whispered softly under her breath, "Unseen. He does not break." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if praying her son's spirit would remain unshaken. The air thickened with tension, the laughter of the guests now nervous and unsure. The mansion seemed to breathe, every shadow leaning closer to listen. Lord Harrington rose slowly, the sound of his cane against the marble louder than the whispers that scattered. His voice cut like iron as he said, "This hall does not welcome filth." Alexander smirked, pride swelling at his father's words. Ethan met the patriarch's gaze without fear, his voice steady. "Filth grows when truth is buried." Margaret's breath caught sharply, her silence still unbroken but her eyes glistening. Clara stepped back into the shadows, every detail burning into her memory. The air grew heavier, candles flickered, as if even fire bowed under Harrington's glare. The guests exchanged nervous glances, sensing a storm far older than the man who stood at its center. The hall hushed as Ethan stepped forward, his boots dripping rain onto the marble floor. He said, "Every wall here is built on silence, and silence cracks louder than screams." Alexander scoffed, but his laughter rang hollow. Margaret trembled, her lips parting, though no sound came. Lord Harrington's hand tightened on his cane, his jaw rigid, eyes narrowing at the defiance. Clara's heart raced, each beat echoing with the weight of truth too long hidden. The guests leaned in, uneasy, torn between fear and fascination. Ethan's words carved into the room like a blade, leaving silence that felt heavier than stone. For the first time the mansion itself seemed to listen, its echoes betraying the arrogance that had ruled for generations. The rain-soaked night lingered in Ethan's memory as he stood by the old window of the servant quarters, the cracked glass rattling in the wind. His voice whispered inside, unheard by others, "Humiliation is a cloak I will no longer wear." Margaret entered quietly, her steps soft against the worn wooden floor, carrying a small bowl of bread she had saved. She said, "You must eat, even if pride makes food bitter." Ethan looked at her with eyes burning. "Pride keeps me alive when nothing else does." Her hands trembled, yet her face held strength as she placed the bowl beside him. Clara passed the corridor outside, pausing briefly, her curiosity unspoken, but her silence deliberate. The shadows of the mansion stretched long, pressing down even in the servants' quarters. Ethan's chest rose with defiance, his hunger forgotten in the weight of survival. Margaret's tired hands traced the edge of the wooden table, her voice steady despite years of silence. She said, "I worked these halls until my back bent, yet still they call me nothing." Ethan touched her arm gently, his words soft. "You are more than their gold could ever buy." Her eyes glistened as she looked at him, remembering every cruel order barked, every humiliation endured without protest. Clara lingered outside the door, holding her breath, hearing truths never meant for the rich walls. Margaret whispered, "I gave my life to their service, but they will never own my soul." Ethan nodded, jaw tight. "Their laughter cannot erase who we are." The room filled with silence, heavy but not empty, a silence that carried unspoken strength. The grand dining hall gleamed under golden chandeliers, laughter spilling like wine, and Alexander raised his glass high. He said, "Some are born for marble floors, others for dirt paths." Guests chuckled, eyes turning briefly to Ethan, as if his shadow still stained the room. Ethan stood near the farthest wall, serving in silence, every word cutting into his pride. Clara balanced a tray, watching the cruel theater unfold. Lord Harrington sipped his wine with cold disinterest, his approval silent yet sharp, dotting. Alexander leaned toward the guests, his smirk cruel. "The poor mistake silence for dignity. But it is only fear." Ethan's eyes locked with his, no words spoken, but defiance burned clear. The hall filled with glitter and cruelty, but the air cracked with unspoken challenge. Clara slipped into the kitchen, her heart pounding as she whispered to herself, "Cruelty spreads faster than fire in this house." The cooks avoided her eyes, silence heavy with fear. Margaret entered, carrying empty plates, her steps heavy with exhaustion. She said, "Do not speak too loudly, child. The walls here have sharper ears than men." Clara set the tray down, her jaw tight, "Then let them hear the truth one day." Margaret sighed, her back bent from years of labor, yet her eyes glowed faintly with pride at the girl's courage. Ethan appeared at the doorway, his face stern, his voice low. "Truth waits, but it never dies." The three shared a glance, a fragile bond forming in the shadows of the kitchen's flickering firelight. Later that night, Ethan sat alone on the stone steps outside the mansion, the rain falling harder, soaking his shoulders. His voice broke the silence. "They laugh because they fear truth more than poverty." Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating his stormy eyes. Margaret stood behind the door, unseen, listening with a heart heavy but proud. Clara leaned against the wooden frame, whispering, "He does not bend." Inside, Alexander's laughter carried faintly through the walls, sharp but hollow. Lord Harrington's shadow moved past the window, his presence a reminder of power unbroken. Ethan lifted his face to the rain, his whisper fierce, "I will not kneel, not even to gold." The storm swallowed his words, but the night carried them like prophecy. The banquet swelled with laughter as Alexander rose, his voice cutting through the hall like glass. He said, "A man who tastes dirt should never sit where kings dine." The guests laughed, raising their glasses in cruel delight. Ethan stood at the edge, his patched coat clinging to him, yet his eyes burned with fire. Margaret gripped a tray, her knuckles pale, whispering to herself for strength. Clara's gaze darted across the hall, capturing the cruelty and the silent defiance that clashed in the air. Lord Harrington struck his cane once, a sign of approval that sealed Ethan's humiliation. Alexander leaned closer to the guests, sneering, "This beggar will never rise above his place." Ethan's lips pressed together, his silence cutting sharper than words. The hall glittered with gold, yet shadows gathered where dignity refused to break. The marble floor echoed as Lord Harrington rose, his presence crushing the room into silence. He said, "There are lines between blood and mud, and tonight, all will remember them." Alexander smirked proudly, nodding at his father's words. Ethan's jaw tightened, his voice low yet steady. "Lines drawn in cruelty are written in dust." Margaret froze, her heart pounding, wishing she could shield him from the storm. Clara took a step back, her eyes flicking nervously as the guests murmured like restless birds. Lord Harrington's cane struck the ground, the sound sharp as thunder. "You will never forget your place," he growled. Ethan stared at him, unflinching, his silence a blade sharper than gold. The hall bristled with tension, as though the mansion itself feared what would come next. In the quiet servant hall, Margaret sat on a wooden bench, her hands trembling as she pressed them together. She whispered, "They grind us down, but we still stand." Ethan leaned against the wall, his face shadowed by flickering lamplight. He said, "Standing is all I have left, but I will not bow." Clara entered softly, her voice hushed but urgent. "Their cruelty grows each hour, yet they do not see your strength." Margaret touched Ethan's sleeve, her eyes filled with tears. "Your silence carries more weight than their goal." He looked at her, his words fierce, then let silence break them. The flicker of the lamp deepened the shadows, the small room brimming with dignity the mansion would never claim. Whispers spread across the mansion as servants avoided Ethan's gaze, their loyalty swallowed by fear. Alexander passed through the corridor, his smirk cruel as he said, "Even rats know better than to side with the drowning." Ethan did not reply, but his silence carried defiance that unsettled the air. Margaret watched from a distance, her heart torn by the sight of allies turning away. Clara clutched her tray, whispering under her breath, "Fear makes cowards of them all." Alexander turned, his eyes narrowing, but Ethan stood calm, refusing to flinch. The walls seemed to lean closer, trapping dignity beneath their weight. Every step Alexander took echoed like mockery, yet Ethan's stillness grew heavier than his words. The night deepened, thunder growling beyond the mansion walls as the storm outside mirrored the one within. Clara whispered to herself, "Even stone will crack under such weight." Ethan stood at the window of the servants' quarters, rain streaking the glass like tears. Margaret sat nearby, her eyes closed, silent prayers escaping her lips. Alexander's laughter drifted faintly from the banquet above, cruel and hollow. Lord Harrington's heavy footsteps echoed across the hall, a reminder of chains unseen. Ethan turned, his voice steady. "They think silence is weakness, but silence waits until the right word shatters the world." Clara's breath caught, knowing the storm was closer than ever. The shadows wrapped the room, carrying the promise of fire yet to come. The storm outside crashed as the mansion doors burst open, and Samuel entered, his coat torn, his eyes blazing with fire. The guests froze, whispers rising like sparks in dry wood. Alexander sneered, "Who dares enter uninvited?" Samuel's voice cracked the silence, "One who carries your blood, though denied its name." Lord Harrington's face drained of color, his hand tightening on his cane. Margaret gasped, her hand rising to her mouth as old secrets clawed to the surface. Clara pressed against the wall, her heart hammering as truth stormed into the room. Ethan's gaze locked on Samuel, recognizing the same fire in his eyes. The hall felt like it split in two, the air heavy with revelation none could contain. Samuel's voice thundered, "You cast me out, yet your face lives in mine." Gasps echoed as he stepped forward, each stride a strike against Harrington's power. Alexander shouted, "Lies, a beggar's trick." But his protest wavered as eyes shifted between the two men, seeing undeniable resemblance. Margaret whispered, "The truth was buried, but blood never hides forever." Lord Harrington's jaw clenched, his silence screaming guilt. Ethan stood tall, his heart racing, knowing the stranger was bound to his own fate. Clara gripped the tray in her hands, whispering, "The house will crack tonight." Samuel's words dripped with fury, "You denied me my name, but not my fire." The guests whispered louder, their voices trembling, "He looks just like him." Samuel's glare burned into Harrington. "Your empire rests on silence, but silence breaks when truth walks in." Alexander's face twisted, his pride cracking as doubt seeped through. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, decades of secrets clawing free. Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady. "Blood binds more than wealth, and it binds you now." Clara's lips parted as she whispered, "They can no longer hide." Harrington's voice finally broke, sharp and cold. "You are nothing." Samuel's roar followed. "I am your son." The mansion itself seemed to tremble, its walls echoing with a truth denied for too long. Lord Harrington's cane trembled as he raised it, his voice sharp. "You were erased because you were a stain." Samuel's voice thundered back, "No, I am the proof of your cruelty." Alexander's face hardened, his voice sharp with desperation. "Father, do not let him shatter us." Margaret's tears spilled as she whispered, "The sins of fathers weigh on sons." Ethan clenched his fists, fury burning in his silence. Clara whispered, "The chains are breaking." The hall shook with storm thunder as Harrington shouted, "You will never be Harrington." Samuel's eyes blazed, his voice cutting deeper. "Then I will be the truth you fear." The silence shattered as Samuel stepped closer, his voice sharp. "You built these walls on lies, but lies rot from within." Harrington's face twisted with rage, his hand gripping the cane as if it could strike down truth itself. Alexander's voice broke, "You cannot let him take what is ours." Ethan's voice rose, steady as stone. "What is yours crumbles when truth stands against it." Margaret's whisper cut through like a prayer. "Justice comes even when unwanted." Clara's breath trembled as she whispered, "The house itself feels the weight of his words." Thunder roared, and Samuel declared, "Your blood is mine, and tonight the world will know it." The mansion trembled with a new storm, one of revelation. The hall shook with storm thunder as Alexander lunged toward Ethan, his voice cutting like knives. "You shame us with your silence, beggar!" Ethan's eyes flared, his voice sharp. "Your cruelty feeds on fear, but fear does not live here." Guests gasped as their glasses rattled, shadows stretching long across the marble. Margaret cried out, her trembling voice breaking, "Enough of this torment!" Clara stepped closer, her heart pounding. "The truth has already burned its mark." Alexander struck the table with his fist, roaring, "You will kneel!" Ethan's chest rose, defiance unbroken. "I kneel only to truth, not to thieves in silk." The storm outside cracked lightning across the hall, as if the heavens themselves declared war. Margaret's voice rose, trembling but powerful. "I bore the weight of silence for decades, but tonight I will not." Her eyes locked on Harrington. "You buried a son, you shattered a name, and you fed arrogance with lies." Samuel's face burned with pain and fury, his voice sharp. "Her truth is mine, and it is yours to answer." Clara gasped, whispering, "Her silence finally breaks." Harrington's cane quivered as he hissed, "You know nothing of sacrifice." Margaret stepped forward, her hand trembling yet unshaken. "I know everything of sacrifice, and none of it was yours." The hall filled with her voice, heavier than thunder, cutting through gold and cruelty alike. Samuel's voice roared, "You denied me blood, you denied me name, but you cannot deny the face that mirrors your own." He ripped open the collar of his shirt, showing a medallion, tarnished but bearing the Harrington crest. Guests gasped, their voices colliding like waves. Alexander's voice broke with rage. "Fraud, a trick to poison us." Harrington's hand tightened on his cane, but his eyes betrayed terror. Ethan spoke firmly, "Truth needs no crown, it stands on its own." Margaret wept, whispering, "The child they buried stands before them." Clara whispered, "The walls themselves are listening." The storm outside raged louder, as if the sky demanded confession. Lord Harrington's voice cracked, fury and fear entwined. "You are nothing but shame carved into flesh." Samuel stepped closer, his voice burning. "Shame belongs to the man who abandoned his own blood." Alexander shouted, "He will never stand among us." Ethan's voice thundered in reply, "He already stands taller than your arrogance." Margaret's voice trembled but cut deep, "You cannot erase truth with wealth." Clara clutched her chest, whispering, "The house trembles with their words." Harrington struck his cane against the marble, but the sound no longer silenced the storm. Samuel's roar shook the hall, "I am your son, and I will no longer be denied." The storm's roar fell silent as Ethan stepped into the center, his soaked coat dripping on marble. His voice rang like steel, "Gold rots, lies crumble, but truth endures. Alexander's face twisted, his words broken. You will never belong. Ethan's eyes burned as he whispered, belonging is not granted by thieves. Harrington's cane slipped from his grasp, clattering like broken chains. Margaret cried openly, her voice trembling. The word he speaks will end generations of cruelty. Clara whispered, the mansion holds its breath. Ethan raised his head, his voice cutting through centuries. Enough. The word echoed, shaking walls, silencing laughter, breaking the power that had ruled for too long. Alexander staggered back, his silk coat stained with spilled wine, his voice cracking. This house belongs to me. Guests averted their eyes, their loyalty withering. Ethan's words echoed. It belongs to no tyrant. Alexander slammed his fist on the table, but his fury rang hollow. Samuel's glare pierced him. Power rots when it clings to fear. Margaret's trembling hand rose, pointing at Alexander. Your cruelty is inherited, not earned. Clara whispered, even gold cannot shield him now. The guests stood in silence, watching the air crumble before them. The storm outside began to ease, but the one inside left Alexander stripped of dignity. Margaret stepped into the center of the hall, her voice steady. I carried their shame, but I will not carry it further. Harrington's eyes darkened, his hand trembling on his cane. Samuel's voice cracked with emotion. Her silence was my prison, her truth my freedom. Ethan whispered fiercely, her words are the storm they fear most. Clara's lips parted, her heart racing. The servant's truth weighs heavier than the master's gold. Harrington tried to speak, but the words faltered, his authority crumbling under her quiet strength. The chandeliers flickered as if bowing to her defiance. Samuel lifted the tarnished medallion high, his voice carrying, this crest denied me, but it cannot erase me. Gasps rippled through the guests. Alexander shouted, you will never claim it. Harrington's lips tightened, his silence louder than denial. Ethan stepped forward, his voice fierce. A house without truth is already in ruins. Margaret cried softly, the child who suffered in shadows now stands in the light. Clara whispered, the lie is dead, and the blood speaks louder. Samuel's hand shook, but his gaze burned unyielding, the crest gleaming in stormlight like a curse unveiled. Ethan stood taller, his voice steady. I was mocked as dirt, yet I carried dignity none of you could steal. Alexander's fists shook, but no words came. Margaret's tears fell freely. You endured what broke others. Samuel nodded, his tone sharp, and you stood when I could not. Clara whispered, the poorest man now holds the richest strength. Harrington's cane slipped, his hand trembling as the storm outside faded into silence. Ethan's chest rose, his voice soft but resolute. We are not broken, we are unshaken. The hall felt emptied of arrogance, filled only with the weight of consequence. The guests whispered in hushed tones, their laughter long silenced. Clara's voice trembled as she whispered, the cost of truth is heavy, but silence costs more. Margaret stood close to Ethan, her hand on his arm, her eyes proud. Samuel's shoulders sagged with years of anger lifting. Justice may not heal, but it reveals. Alexander's gaze fell, his arrogance shattered into shame. Harrington sank into his chair, his cane fallen, a man crushed by his own legacy. Ethan's voice echoed. The storm has passed, but its scars will remain. The mansion stood silent, no longer ruled by gold, but haunted by truth. The mansion fell into silence, its chandeliers swaying softly, as though exhausted by the storm. Ethan stood in the center of the hall, water dripping from his coat onto the marble floor. Margaret's weary voice trembled. The walls will never laugh again. Samuel leaned against a pillar, his shoulders heavy with years reclaimed but scarred. Clara whispered to herself, the silence is louder than their cruelty. Alexander's eyes stared blankly, his pride shattered beyond repair. Lord Harrington's gaze dropped to the ground, his authority reduced to ash. Ethan's steady voice broke the silence. What remains is truth, and it will echo long after us. The hall seemed to bow to his words, heavy with consequence. Lord Harrington sat motionless in his chair, the cane lying broken at his feet. His voice faltered, almost a whisper. "Everything I built has turned against me." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her words firm. "You built nothing but chains." Samuel's tone carried bitterness and sorrow. "Your blood lives in me, but your cruelty will not." Ethan's face softened for a moment, his words sharp yet calm. "Power built on silence dies when silence ends." Clara whispered, "Even kings fall when truth breathes." Harrington's hands trembled, his legacy fractured beyond repair. The storm outside had ceased, but the quiet inside the hall cut deeper than thunder. Alexander stumbled through the wreckage of pride, his silk torn and his voice hoarse. The laughter is gone. His eyes darted to the guests, but none returned his gaze. Ethan's voice struck. "Laughter built on cruelty leaves only echoes of shame." Clara whispered, "He is no heir, only hollow pride." Samuel turned away, his expression filled with disgust. "The crown you wore was made of lies." Margaret's voice cut through, weary but strong. "Your arrogance ends tonight." Alexander's fists trembled, yet he could not speak. The air was heavy, thick with his downfall, the mansion no longer echoing his cruelty. Ethan stepped toward the great doors of the mansion, rain-soaked night waiting beyond. His voice steady, he said, "These walls will never own me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears of pride. "You walk free, stronger than gold." Samuel's voice carried relief. "The lies that bound us have fallen." Clara whispered, "Even shadows cannot follow him now." Alexander collapsed into a chair, silent and broken. Harrington remained hunched, staring into the emptiness he could not command. Ethan paused at the threshold, the weight of victory heavy, but the dignity of truth heavier still. The night air wrapped around Ethan as he stepped into the darkness, the storm clouds parting to reveal a faint moon. Margaret's voice broke softly behind him. "We are free at last." Samuel's eyes closed, his whisper heavy. "The truth carries us forward." Clara's breath shook. "The house will never forget tonight." Alexander buried his face in his hands, his arrogance in ruins. Harrington sat hollow, his empire reduced to dust and whispers. Ethan turned once more, his stormy eyes unyielding, his voice a whisper that cut like a blade. "Generations end here." The mansion loomed behind him, silent, broken and haunted forever.